Safe is all relative. It's all based on your time horizon, right? So you might have money in your checking account. It feels safe. It's not losing value. It's not fluctuating. But there is a hidden tax, if you will, with inflation where it is losing value over time. In the long term, even though maybe stocks or even real estate might feel more risky because it is moving up and down, in the long term, it's actually safer because it's keeping up with inflation.
Welcome to the Money Skills for Therapists podcast, where we answer this question: how can therapists and health practitioners go from money shame and confusion to feeling calm and confident about their finances and get money really working for them in both their private practice and their lives? I'm your host, Linzy Bonham, therapist turned money coach and creator of the course Money Skills for Therapists. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's guest is TJ Gerven. TJ is a financial advisor and planner, the founder of Modern Wealth Builders, and he's also a host of another podcast about money, Do More With Your Money. Today, TJ and I get into some of the behavioral biases that we tend to have around money as people. It's helpful, I find, to learn these kind of buckets of biases, because then we can start to understand, like, oh, this behavior that I have that feels very specific to me is actually a certain type of bias that's out there. So we explore some of the behavioral biases that lead us to act certain ways and make certain mistakes with money. We talk about investing and talk about the importance of putting your money somewhere that it will grow, how our scarcity and fear and kind of clutching onto money, keeping it in checking accounts actually can work against us. We talk a little bit about some more kind of like financial nerd stuff than I tend to get into here, like the rule of 72, how long it takes for money to double and how to understand how long it'll take your money to double based on where you're keeping it, which is all really important stuff for building long-term financial stability. So, in Money Skills for Therapists, in Money Skills for Group Practice Owners, what I am teaching and helping folks to really understand are the foundational pieces of money, how to really understand your money in your business, get clear on it, make tweaks, keep it up, have that really clear, grounded relationship with money. Once you build those skills and you have your feet on the ground, the kind of stuff that TJ and I talk about today, this is the next step, right? It's how to be strategic about your money in the long term. So future you, when they go to retire, is very grateful for present you for starting to put some of these wheels in motion, putting money in the right places, really thinking through where your money is going to grow and how your money can serve you in your life too. We also talk a little bit today about the book Die with Zero, which I just read once, and I'm finished the book and went right back to the beginning to start again, because I feel like there's so much good stuff in there about the actual function of money, how money can serve us in our lives. TJ and I talk about that a bit today. We covered a lot of ground. Here is my conversation with TJ Gerven. So TJ, welcome to the podcast.
Awesome. Thank you for having me on, Linzy.
I'm happy to have you here. Like, something that I'm very aware of in my work that I do with therapists is, I see myself as a financial educator. I'm helping them like understand the basics. But there's so many dimensions to money, right? And there's so many pieces, and like personal finance is its whole other own world in itself. And that is the world that you occupy, if I understand, is helping folks with their personal finances and like their behaviors around money.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's my goal, is to be a partner for my clients. So really understanding that they're great at what they do, just like the people that you focus on with therapists and private practices are great at what they do. But we all, have a chosen profession for a reason. That's our area of expertise. And so, just because you're really smart in one domain, smart people hire smart people to delegate and look for blind spots, look for ways to optimize. And so really what I'm here is a sounding board for people to quantify trade-offs for them. Again, point out any blind spots. We all have certain kind of behavioral biases, which I think we're going to get into today. And so really, I make the same, mistakes that clients make. And so really, we can all use a professional or somebody at least as a sounding board who has our best interest.
Totally. Yeah. It's always so much easier for somebody else. First of all, with expertise, of course, but even just having that outside perspective to help reflect back, like, what's happening there? Or like, I'm noticing this, because we all, get it in our own heads and don't see our own biases, of course.
Absolutely. And I think we can lose sight of the bigger picture. I think, a lot of times people want to focus on like, how do I accumulate as much as possible, right? To achieve maybe this arbitrary number for financial independence or whatever that may be. And so I really like to take a step back and say, well, what are we trying to actually solve for here? And what is the fastest path to that? Because at the end of the day, money is just a tool. you can't take it with you. Obviously, there's some cliches around that,
Absolutely.
but we don't want, I mean, there's an interesting book called Die with
I
Zero.
just read it. I'm reading it a
Did you
second
just read
time.
it? Yeah.
Yes.
I figured you might have,
Yes.
and I'm sure your audience has heard of it
No,
as
I don't
well. And
think
so
they
I
have. So
really,
tell them a little bit about the book before we get into it, because it's new on my radar
yeah,
and I've been telling everybody about it.
yeah, just understanding this concept of using your money as a tool intentionally and, basically thinking about ways that you can use it to help people today, right? So for
Mhm.
example, if you have, kids that you want to pass on inheritance to, they may be better served by giving it to them sooner rather than later, because if they wait until they're in their
Yeah,
50s, they're kind of past that time where they could have
totally.
really used that
Yes.
help. And so really thinking strategically about, again, not just accumulating as much as possible, but
Mhm.
how can I use this money intentionally?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I want to speak about that a little bit and then we'll get into the work that you do. But I know that reading Die with Zero has really got me thinking about, health and wealth and the relationship between those things. And as you say, timing, right? So I do think that there's this bias towards like we save, we save, we save, we save, we try to accumulate. And, in the book, he talks about like folks are worth the most money when they retire, but that's the point when your health is also starting to decline. So there's all these great
Right.
things that you might have been able to do with that money in your 30s, 40s, 50s that are not available to you once you get into your retirement years. And I see this with my own parents who are so healthy and so active, but like my dad, one of his hips went. So like that slows you down. And even if you want to do all these great things, life is
Right.
harder. You're limited in your abilities. And then he got that fixed and now his second hip is gone. So it's like, even though they're relatively healthy and active, he can't do certain things now that he would have been able to do and enjoy when he was 50. Like he could have gone on a mountain climbing trip when he was 45. He actually can't physically do that at 72. So really thinking about like, where can your money serve you now? Not kind of always deferring off
Exactly.
into the future. Because the future is not
Which is
usually
a
as good as we
difficult,
think it's going to be.
100%. And there, that's hard to strike that balance between, living for the present while still thinking about the
Yeah.
future. Some people are going to be past focused. Some people are going to be present focused. Some people are going to be future focused. And so it's good to have that balanced perspective and really think of, am I making decisions today using the resources I have that's really going to solve for lifetime fulfillment? Kind of this idea of like self-actualization,
Yeah.
right? And really thinking through like, what is the use, like what is the best use of my time, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
money is the tool that helps us exchange what we've earned for
Yes.
time. And so that's where, and we can talk about some of the biases as far as like
Mm-hmm.
scarcity
Yes.
mindset and feeling that we have to hold on to this money when we could get more value from it today by using it and spending it for
Absolutely.
things
Yes,
intentionally.
for sure. So let's get into some of those biases, because I know that my understanding is there's a certain kind of archetypes of different money behaviors or biases that we can tend to have. Tell me a little bit more about the behavioral biases that you see in your clients and even that you
Sure.
see in yourself when it comes to making decisions around money.
Yeah, there's a ton. I mean, I try to, be honest with myself when I catch and you don't always catch it. That's the part with
Yeah.
biases, right? You can never really catch it unless there's an outside person looking at you. But there's a few different ones. I think like mental accounting is a big one. So not treating money the same in different realms. A lot of
Yes.
times people will take a ton of time to research, how to buy, an appliance from
Yes. Yes.
Costco, but they won't think about the expense ratios in
Mm.
their investments, right? Which could
Mm.
be causing, which could be expensive over time,
Sure.
right? And so there's really these things that add a lot of lifetime value. Tax planning is another one. They don't think about all the ways that they could minimize their lifetime tax bill,
Mm-hmm.
which is difficult because we don't know the future. But so mental accounting is a big
Yeah.
one. Overconfidence bias is a big one.
Okay.
So, basically I work with a lot of people with company stock. And so
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times they feel very bullish on their company stock because they work there. When we know the data shows that, most of these companies are going to underperform
Right.
the
Right.
stock market. So
Yeah.
things like that.
And just to stop and define for a
Yeah, go ahead.
moment, bullish, for folks who are listening and are
Mhm.
not into the investment world, what does bullish mean?
Yeah. So if you're bullish, it just means that you expect the share price of your
Mm-hmm.
stock to increase over
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
time,
Yeah.
which may or may not be true. I mean, I think there's a hard, with individual stocks is very different than the market as a whole. And so, yeah, bullish just means you expect it to
Yes.
go up.
And that was the confidence bias? What was that one called?
Overconfidence
Overconfidence. Yes.
bias.
Yes.
Yes, you have an exceeding amount of confidence because you have material involved. You
Yes.
work for that
I've heard
company.
that too with investments, and I see this in my own behavior. So I'm Canadian, and I've heard that in terms of people's investment holdings, whatever country you live in, you tend to
Mm,
hold obviously a much higher amount of that that particular country's stocks, right? So like for myself in my own investment strategy, we keep, I believe it's 30% Canadian, 30% American, and then the rest like 40% international. But, you know, you have to kind of work against that own bias to be like, well, obviously Canada's great because I'm from Canada, right? And like the American stock market's a little different because it is a powerhouse, which is why we have so much American. But people who live in the Netherlands do the same thing. They're going to hold like 30%, you know, Dutch stock just because they're Dutch, right? So we have that personal connection to something, so we're biased towards it.
100%. That's a geographical type of bias, and that's a very common one. Yeah, if you look, Americans in particular hold a disproportionate amount of the U.S. stock market. And while it's performed so great in recent years, if we actually look at the longer term track history, there is benefits to owning, you know, international exposure. And who knows? I mean, there's very rare examples, not to get, again, technical weeds, but if you look at Japan, there was a time period where Japan had a major stock market bubble. It actually took them over 20 years. They just recently really, or 30 years even, to get back to all-time highs. So it is possible for countries to experience stock market bubbles. For sure.
Yeah, of course. And so, yeah, this is kind of going all in on something is what I'm hearing. This is the overconfidence bias, going all in on something because it's familiar to you, rather than thinking like big picture of like, is this thing really better than all these other things just because I have a personal connection to it?
100%. Or in a certain example too is like your domain expertise. Just because you're really great in your domain doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be great in this other domain. And the hard thing with investing in particular, we can talk about financial planning, but with investing is it is primarily behavioral. And that's why, you know, more effort doesn't necessarily correlate to better returns. So that's a hard thing for really smart people to understand, because they always want to try to figure out like, what is the best strategy here to maximize returns.
Yeah. I think there's maybe like an efforting bias there. It's like, if I work hard, it'll be better rather than being strategic about what you're doing.
Which makes sense, because in every aspect of your life, there is a correlation there typically, right? When you study harder, you do better in your test, right? So that's not necessarily the case with investing.
And in therapists, I see a bias towards that, the like over-efforting with overworking. Right? It's like, well, if I see more clients, I'll make more money. But there isn't necessarily that thinking out of like, yeah, but then I don't have the energy to make dinner, so I'm going to be eating out more. I'm going to be doing more like convenient stuff. Maybe I'll be drinking more. Like, what are the costs associated with that effort that might actually mean you have less money at the end of the day because you have less bandwidth to make intentional decisions?
That's an amazing point, because I like to call it return on hassle. So like when we're thinking about like your financial planning, right? And this happens a lot with, I would say, rental properties. I work with a lot of millennials, and they love the idea of rental properties, but they don't necessarily think through the numbers and the logistics behind it, as far as, you may be able to generate some level of return, but how much time, effort, energy are you going to put into this? And what is that return on hassle? I'm a big fan of, again, practical, pragmatic, use your money as a tool. Do you really want to be a landlord? Do you want to take time to think about those things?
Absolutely. And that's something that I've talked with folks before, because like we have a rental property, and partially we have a rental property actually just for like a greater good purpose. Like, it's actually not a great financial investment for me. And it's funny because when we built it, my partner is a politician. So when people found out that we had built a rental property and we were renting it at market rent, we received a lot of hate on Reddit and other scary places, because there was this idea that we were like becoming fat cats, and it was like laughable, because I was like, if you look at the return we're going to get from this investment compared to like the work that we're putting in and the other kind of like ripple out expenses that came from it, like we destroyed our whole backyard. Now we have to rebuild a whole backyard, right? We had to replace our whole sewage system because we discovered like there's all these costs. But I think, again, there's this bias towards this idea that like, well, that must be a good investment. You must be making a ton of money. And it's like quite the contrary. I would have been much better just investing in one of the ETFs that I know is reliable and leaving it alone. And I would have had a lot more time. And so it's, thinking there's that bias, this idea that like, obviously, if you're doing more or you have this thing, you'll make more money. But that's definitely not necessarily true. You have to make sure you're actually doing something you want to do.
Absolutely. And that, you bring up some interesting points there. And I don't want to like defend landlords, but that is a common thing where it's like, oh, they're like, your landlord's raising your rent. It's like, well, it is a function of the market and what it costs. And if you really look at the cost of ownership of these properties, you have personal experience with that, you can see it's not always the best
No,
investment.
no, it's not. Yeah. But some folks are really biased towards it. And it would be hard
Right.
to tell them that. Let's review the behavioral biases so far, because this is really helpful,
Sure.
like boxes for folks to think about. So we talked first about the
Mental
mental
accounting would be the
accounting.
first
Okay.
one.
Yeah.
Yep. Overconfidence.
Yes. 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 What other biases do you see show up often for folks?
Sure. Yeah. I would say, like a scarcity mindset
Yes.
is
Yes.
one that I definitely have this, and it's good to analyze again. And this is a great area for you guys because thinking about, childhood experiences and how that impacts you as an adult.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, for me, I consider myself like a solo entrepreneur, and it's hard to sometimes reinvest money when I started my practice with 0 clients and grew it over time very slowly, kind of a profit first mentality.
Yes.
And so it's hard for me to, even though there is a clear return on investment there, to kind of give up that money and reinvest and spend. And so I tend to attract clients, I think, with similar mindsets who are hardworking, but maybe have some of that
Yes. Yes.
scarcity mindset. And so really just, showing them and quantifying for them, if they're a high earner and they have the resources, it's like, hey, you have so much bandwidth here. You have so much margin for error, and you're really living below your means so much, which is fine. But if there's ways that you can use your money today to enhance your life, you're not sacrificing your financial future. This is something you should consider.
Absolutely. And I see a lot of the scarcity mindset in the folks who take money skills for therapists. And it's often there's a story, right? Like these biases come from somewhere. And I'm curious for yourself or for your clients, like where have you seen some of the scarcity mindset come from? Like what kinds of experiences tend to lead to scarcity mindset?
Yeah, I mean, if you grew up in I have some Indian clients who grew up in India, and obviously they have certain cultural things that they feel with money there. And also it's really people that tend to not come from money.
Yes.
I'll just speak for myself. I had a kind of unique upbringing where my mom did come from some generational wealth, but was more of a spendthrift and had some issues there. And then my dad came from poverty. His parents were Dutch immigrants, and he was one of 6. His dad died when he was a baby, so he was just his mother. And so basically he had a very scarcity mindset, which were probably where I got it from, where all we talked about growing up was money. And he was very into real estate because for him, he's a blue collar tradesman. He could build a house himself, which is very impressive.
Yes, seriously.
But if you really factor in, again, your time and return on hassle and all these things, it is a ton of work for necessarily not the best like return. And so, for me, I was always trying to figure out what is the best use of your resources from a practical standpoint. And that's what I try to help clients with because of that.
Yeah. Because what I see with that, I think about my own family, and my grandmother passed away last year. So it's kind of like the last remnants of her and my grandfather's efforts, were distributed. And similarly, both came from poverty. My grandmother came from quite extreme poverty, big families, like 9 to 11 kids in both of their families, my grandmother and my grandfather. My grandfather was a farmer where there was that like unpredictability, like you have a bad season and you could make no money for a whole year's worth of work, right? So there was a lot of real precarity and scarcity there. You're basically like at the will of the weather gods, and you could work super, super hard and be like, well, we're dipping into our savings from last year. It's out of your control, right? So if I look at how my grandparents lived their lives, and they did manage to basically move up a class bracket to become middle class. But going back to Die with Zero as well, when my grandmother died, she was 98 years old, and she had $300,000 for each of her 3 daughters. So she died with $900,000. And that was like at 98. It's like way in the end of her life. And when I think about my grandparents' lives, I wish they had spent that money. Like, I wish that they had gone on more trips together. Like, I wish that they had taken more time off. Like, if I just think about the value of that money, and by the time that money was dispersed to their 3 daughters, their daughters are in their 70s. Like they don't need it, really they're also as I mentioned earlier, starting to come into like poorer health, and their worlds are getting like a little bit smaller, as naturally happens as you get older. And so, if I think about that money, like they made such strategic decisions in terms of growing investments, but I don't think they really got the value out of their money that they could have.
And that's where it's kind of a, interesting concept to think about. But as a retiree, you do want to focus on not just overspending in retirement, but underspending in retirement, right? So those are the two things to think through.
Yes.
which is not necessarily normal. And there is, I would say, a bias in the financial industry, right, to kind of make sure that people do kind of die with more
Yes.
money because maybe they're incentivized, they get compensated on
Oh,
that. So
interesting.
there is something to
Okay.
consider
Yeah.
there.
Can you
Yeah,
talk about that
not
a
to
little
throw
bit more?
shade.
Because, we have had other financial advisors on the podcast before, and I always want to help my audience understand that there are financial advisors who are just fee for service, who are there to just like serve
Mhm.
you. And then there's folks who are actually like making money based on the financial decisions that you're guiding you in making. So can you talk a little bit about that piece that you just
Yeah.
referenced?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's always going to be conflicts of interest regardless of fee model. So I want to throw that
Sure.
out there. And I'm not somebody who likes to bash different fee models, but I will say that, in my opinion, there's a couple different distinctions. The first thing is product driven
Mm-hmm.
sales versus, like you said, fee for
Mm-hmm.
service. So if you're working with somebody who's primarily selling financial product and that's how they're compensated, whether it's an investment product or insurance product, that can tend to lead to suboptimal outcomes because they're really just focused on that product
Yeah.
sale, in my
Yeah.
experience. With the fee for service model, that's a cleaner model. However, there still are some conflicts. The industry is predominantly like this AUM model where it's a percentage
Mm-hmm.
of, so,
Yes.
I give you $1 million to
Yes.
invest,
Yes.
I take a percentage, so
Yes.
I'm
And
$10,000 per year.
AUM being assets under management. So they make a
Correct.
percentage of what their client holds.
Correct. Right. So this could again lead to some conflicts of
Yeah.
interest where if you're in retirement and you're focusing on, I don't want to overspend or underspend, you might be underspending, partly if there is a bias there for the advisor to retain those assets because their
Right.
compensation is
Right.
tied to
Because they're
those
going to make
assets.
a lot
So
more money if you are holding on to $600,000 compared to if you're
sure.
holding on to $150,000. Right.
Sure. So that is something to consider. And I'm not saying there are a lot of great advisors who charge
Sure.
AUM who
Sure.
are all about making sure. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that is something to
Yes.
consider. Always think about the incentives of any kind of professional. I mean, for me, the way I think about it is your health is number one, and
Mm-hmm.
then maybe your money is number two. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like when you're working with professionals in those areas, you should always consider those incentives, right? You don't want to work with a doctor who's necessarily like product. They're getting
Yes.
compensated on
Yes.
product,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes.
So
For sure.
yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of those biases, we talked about scarcity, right? Which certainly shows up. And I see this sometimes in students where, I've worked with them for a few months, they've come to calls, I feel like I have a sense of them. And then as part of my course, I offer one-on-ones, and then we'll have a one-on-one conversation, and then they'll let me know that they have massive generational wealth that they don't know what to do with, or
Mm,
that they have a bank account with $75,000 in it that they're not sure what to do with. So I definitely see that show up. And sometimes I talk to folks about like kind of that becomes like a hoarding behavior where the money
sure.
has no job, but you're scared to let go of it. So you're just holding on to it just in case, but yeah, it has no function. I'm curious about what would be the
Sure.
bias that leads to kind of the opposite end of that spectrum of folks who like
Mm,
overspend or can't hold on to money. Is there a certain bias that explains those kinds of behaviors,
mm.
or how do you understand those?
It's a great question. I don't tend to attract
Right. Yeah.
people like that.
Yes.
So I don't really work with them,
Yeah.
but I have personal, like, anecdotal experience with
Yeah.
it. I would say, it definitely comes with your upbringing and
Hmm.
how you viewed money. If you viewed it as kind of an unlimited source and you didn't understand kind of the utility of how difficult it can be to
Yeah.
earn that as a wage earner, for
Yeah.
example, then yeah, you may be inclined to, have habits that are going to lead you down that path. And it all starts with financial literacy, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, I see a couple things like thinking about the origins of those behaviors. One is that I see this narrative of like, I deserve it. Right. So sometimes when folks
Mm,
have come from financial struggles and they grew up without a lot, and I'm thinking about people in my own life who come from that situation, there's kind of this making up for lost time. Like when you get grown up money, you're like, I just want the
yeah.
thing. I want the nice shoes. I want the nice car because they had this feeling of going without as a child. But I've
Right.
also seen that behavior with folks who are scared of the money being taken from them. So either they had an experience of like having family steal money from them, or yeah, there's just like this sense of like the money's not safe.
Entitlement.
Yeah. So it's kind of like you spend it so that you can't lose it. It's like if I spend it, then it goes to something that I want rather than
Mm,
maybe, a distrust of systems that the money will disappear from the banks. But it is, interesting how these different behaviors can really lead to money. And then what I see in my students a lot too is it's just really anxiety provoking. So they just avoid. So they're just kind of like
mm.
driving in the dark with no headlights, spending money, not realizing, oh, I just spent everything that I have, because there's just this fear of being in touch with their numbers or just a lack of kind of literacy there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first step to me is always
Yeah.
awareness. So like having basic understanding of your numbers. If you do feel overwhelmed with money, like you're not making money decisions, it's not even about taking action yet. It's just about gaining
Totally.
awareness, right? So
Yes.
just thinking through your basic numbers, a really great tool that I recommend is Monarch Money
Yes.
if you're looking for cash flow
Yes.
and budgeting.
Yes.
And it's just a tool where you can link all of your financial accounts and just get comfortable with. It's not about making any changes. It's just, hey, do I know my basic numbers? Do
Mm-hmm.
I know over the last 6 months what was my average outflows? What were my average
Yeah.
inflows? Just these basic
Yes.
things. Then you can start to think through what changes can I make? How can I automate things?
Yes.
What is some baseline, habits I want to maintain?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got a framework for teaching both of the courses that I teach, which is commit, clarify, adjust, implement. And that's the clarify stage, right? It's just like, what's even happening here? Where's my money going? And sometimes what I find with my students is they'll look at the money and be like, oh, this is why it feels like I have no money. Because actually, my cost of living is like higher than the paycheck I can pull. So that's why I'm always pulling. And that's why I never have tax money, because I'm always pulling from taxes, because I need more money than I'm making. And that in itself is extremely clarifying to understand, like, oh, it's not just a feeling that I have no money. I actually have no money.
Yeah. And that's a reality that you should
Yes.
confront. And it's unfortunate that the reality is, and I'm not a pessimist, I am a long-term optimist, but the reality is that inflation is always going to be
Yes.
around. It has increased, relative to historical annualized inflation, but just understand that you have to unfortunately figure out a way to generate income that allows you to live below your means,
Yes.
number one. And then with that discretionary income that you have to figure out a way to retain the purchasing power, meaning the value of it, because inflation is eroding that value. And so if you're not transferring your earned wages into wealth,
Yes.
unfortunately, this is where we see this wealth disparity over time, because the people that are transferring into wealth via stock, real estate, commodity, whatever, they're retaining it.
Yes.
And then we get this perpetual cycle of inequality over time.
Yeah. Because, and I notice this goes with the scarcity behavior too, is like people get paralyzed and they don't know where to put the money. So it's just sitting in sometimes a checking account or like a savings account. But, what you're saying is something that I've been talking with my students more about lately is, you have to put it somewhere that it's going to grow. Because as you're saying, every year our money's worth a little bit less. So if you're not putting your money somewhere where it's growing, it's actually losing power over time sitting in that checking account.
100%. And this is kind of, I guess, a bias in some ways where people don't understand, like, safe is all relative. Okay. It's all based on your time horizon, right? So you might have money in your checking account. It feels safe. It's not losing value. It's not fluctuating, but there is a hidden tax, if you will, with inflation where it is losing value over time. And so actually in the long term, even though maybe stocks or even real estate might feel more risky because it is moving up and down, in the long term, it's actually safer because it's keeping up with inflation.
So it's, in the end, acting is actually safer than not acting in terms of putting it somewhere intentionally that it's going to grow is actually a safer move than staying frozen.
Yes. And that is the really hard. And I think from a financial literacy standpoint, if you can get over that mental hump that, hey, it's actually safer. I mean, you should have fundamentals, right? You should have a cash reserve. You should know your numbers. Like, you want to have that margin of safety. But once you do, you really got to get in the mindset of, I'm always investing, or else your money is going to lose value over time.
Yeah. Which is, I'm sure for some folks listening, is a terrifying thing to hear. If they're not investing. Because like what I find with my students is once we do that foundational work of like, okay, here's your numbers. Now you've got some clarity. Now you've made some adjustments. Maybe you've changed the way you've set up your practice. Maybe you've changed your fee. Maybe you're going off of insurance panels. Maybe you're seeing just a couple more clients a week because you realize that makes all the difference. Once you make those adjustments, then you actually have to figure out what to do with the extra money. Like, how do you start to save for the future? And what I find is a lot of folks who have not been already immersing themselves in that world, it can feel really intimidating to figure out investments and like where to invest and which investment vehicles do I use, and do I put it in my SEP IRA or do I, put it in my 401k? Like, it's confusing for people as to where to start.
It is. And the thing I think that's hard, if you are a business owner, right, you have your own practice, there is this dynamic of, and I struggle with this as well, is like figuring out, is my best return on investment reinvesting in my practice or business, or investing elsewhere? Now, the thing is, I don't think most people want to always be tied to their business. And so it is important that they're building outside of that so that they have that ability to retire or achieve financial independence. And that's where you really have to think and look and have that abundance mindset. If you are more of an entrepreneur, where it's like, hey, maybe the best investment is continuing to invest. But then if I do have a profit, am I at least every year looking at maxing out my retirement
Yes.
account or something
Yes.
over time.
Yeah, it's investing in yourself.
Yeah.
But you need to have the clarity to know, if I do A, then B will happen, and that's going to result in there being more money than, say, the
Exactly.
like 7% you could get by putting it in the stock market year over year, right?
Yeah.
And for all of us,
Yeah.
there's probably going to be some sort of limit where your business is at full cruising altitude. And unless you're going to make major changes, you're kind of
Yep.
at the max of what you can earn. And at that point, it makes sense. But I remember when I first started thinking about private practice, I was speaking with my boss at the agency that I worked with, and I had been given some money by my grandparents while they were alive, because that is something they did really well, is they gave their grandchildren, there's only 3 of us, money while they were still alive, so they could see us enjoy, the inheritance that they gave us.
It's awesome.
So I had been gifted this money. I was like a little bit tortured. What do I do with it? The stock market isn't ethical. I don't want to invest in like oil and guns, like tortured liberal kind of stuff. And I was talking to my boss, and she said, like, start your own practice. Like, you are the most ethical thing that you can invest in. And that is absolutely true, because money that I thought I could never make when I was working in an agency making $45,000 a year now is normal money for me, right? But like, that's a much better return than I would have got just investing that money, starting my practice and getting all the education and all the professional development has been a much bigger return on investment. But at a certain point, you've kind of like hit what is probably going to be your max. And then putting, as you say, basically diversifying, right? Putting your money somewhere else, putting it into the stock market, putting it into real estate. So you've got your money growing in a few different ways. It's not all based on you showing up and performing forevermore.
That's a great point. And I think that, understand that the stock market won't be your best return on investment, but it is the most scalable and practical and lowest return on hassle.
Yeah, for sure. Yes.
Right. So, and I like that you use 7%, right? And maybe we can 7, 8, whatever percent we're targeting for a benchmark. It's so important to understand compound interest. What does that mean? What does that look like when you compound 7% over a long time frame? Because that some people, that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you put the time in and you understand the power of compound interest, it actually ends up being quite a lot. And understand that, again, it's repeatable, it's scalable, it's diversified outside of your business. And so even though your best return may not be that, it's still something to consider building.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I just learned the rule of 72. That just came into my radar because I've been chatting with some of my students about this, of like, okay, you've got this money in a checking account. You're going to need to retire in like 15, 20 years. If it sits in your checking account, it's going to lose value. If you put it in the stock market, in a safe, diversified way, it will start to double over time, but like the time frame of that doubling. So the rule of 72.
Yeah. So basically, it's just whatever rate of return that you expect, you divide that into 72, and that's how many years it'll take for your money to double.
So it's like the example that I gave where I said 7%. If we're expecting kind of 7% return from an investment, that would be just a little over 10 years, right? We take 72 divided by 7. So your money will double every 10 years. If you have a 7% return over that time, which is like pretty crazy to think about. Because as you say, 7% sounds like, it's like little.
Yeah, exactly.
But if I put $100,000 in, and in 10 years, that's $200,000. And 10 years after that, that's going to be $400,000. That is a big impact.
Well, I think people confuse simple interest with compound interest, right? So a lot of times in a checking account, it's simple interest. So if I have $1,000 in there and I'm getting 5% interest, let's just say, I'm getting $50. But I'm not getting 5% on 1,050 the next time. With compound interest, I'm making interest on my interest.
Yes.
Right. And so that's where the power comes in, where it's like, then the next time it doubles, it's doubling based on that value there.
Yes. It's beautiful, beautiful math in terms of building like long-term stability. So TJ, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. This has been really helpful information. I know that the folks who listen to this podcast, like this is kind of the next step for them, is starting to understand and think about these things. So it's so helpful to have you here. If folks are interested in hearing more from you, where can they find you?
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm happy it was helpful. Modernwealthbuilders.com is my website. You can learn everything you want there. And I have a podcast called Do More With Your Money, where we explore similar topics.
Wonderful.
Like this.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Coming out of this conversation with TJ, I'm reflecting on that freeze response that so many of us can have around money, that fear of doing it wrong. So we just hold on to it because we're scared of making a mistake. And that piece that he talked about, where it's actually safer to invest your money. It's actually safer in the long run to put your money in real estate and the stock market, I would add in balanced, diversified ways, is a really great reframe on that behavior, because the freeze response tells us that the safest thing to do is nothing, right? But when it comes to money, because of the way the economy works and because our money is losing value over time with inflation, it's actually not safe to do nothing. So that's really a helpful reframe, that it's safer to do something, to put it somewhere that is going to grow. And I would say to put it, into different places. Invest in real estate if you're able to. If you haven't already, certainly start putting that retirement money away. Get advice on how to invest in a way that aligns with your risk tolerance, right? Don't do things that are scary or too risky for you, but you have to do something. You got to put it somewhere that is not just kind of in your metaphorical mattress, which would be like a checking account or a low interest savings account. And as we talked about with the rule of 72, that doubling, that is what's actually going to help you build real financial stability for your later years. But I would say even in between, depending on the type of investment it is, that's what's going to allow you to take that amazing, 20-year anniversary trip with your spouse. Growing your money is essential for your stability, but is also a way to enjoy your life more as you go by making compound interest work for you. So thank you so much to TJ for coming on the podcast today. You can check out the link in the show notes to hear more from him. But I definitely encourage folks who are listening, if you notice you're in that freeze response, start to get some support so you can actually start to make movement with your money. Your future self is definitely going to thank you. You can follow me on Instagram at Money Nuts and Bolts. And if you're enjoying the podcast, tell a friend about it. Tell your colleague. It is so helpful for you to just spread the word about the podcast. It is the best way for other therapists and health practitioners to be part of these conversations. Thanks so much for joining me today.